Leaders of some of the world's most powerful economies are meeting at the G7 summit near Calgary, Canada. President Trump's first meeting today was with Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney, during which the president was asked about the conflict, not about tariffs, but the conflict between Israel and Iran.
What have you heard from the Iranians?
They'd like to talk, but they should have done that before. I had 60 days, and they had 60 days, and on the 61st day, I said, we don't have a deal. They have to make a deal, and it's painful for both parties, but I'd say Iran is not winning this war.
Joining us now, NBC News White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor, who's in Calgary for us, and editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, Ravi Agrawal. Yamiche obviously also asked about tariffs as well, but the issue of Iran and Israel is dominating this G7. What is the latest from the White House on what they are refusing to do?
Well, what's interesting here is that this G7 is, of course, a meeting of the world's largest economies, and it's usually focused on trade and the global economy. But as you said, the issue of Israel and Iran and this recent escalation between these two countries in the Middle East is really dominating a lot of these conversations. President Trump has said that he still wants to try to make a deal with Iran, but that they really need to essentially come back to the table and figure out how to make these concessions that the president wants to make, because he has been having this tariff and this deal negotiation style that is more stick than carrot. In this case, of course, he's adamant that Iran should not be able to develop a nuclear weapon, but he ripped up the last nuclear deal that was negotiated between former President Obama and Iran. So now he's finding himself in having some trouble in getting them back to the negotiating table. That being said, the president has also said he's going to continue to support Iran. So we know that the U.S., while it's not actually putting military officials in Israel, what it is doing is making sure that they are being helped when it comes to pushing back on these defense missiles, missiles that are coming into Israel. And we know now that there's a sort of contradiction here where you have traditional Republicans who are maybe thinking about doing more to help Israel, and then you have MAGA Republicans who don't want to see the president dragged into yet another war. That being said, there's also the big issue of trade deals. The president wants to walk away with some, and it's just not clear whether or not he's going to be able to do that. As you said, he met with the Prime Minister of Canada. He's also meeting with the heads of state of Germany, as well as the UK, and then tomorrow he's supposed to be meeting with Mexico's leaders and Ukraine. But it's just still a big question whether or not he actually walks away with some of the trade deals that he wants. Katie.
All right, Ravi, so what are the conversations likely to be like behind the scenes between these great economic powers and the man who's trying to disrupt everything?
I mean, there's going to be a lot of disagreement. The strangest thing for me, Katie, is that the G7 is not just about size, it's about values. If it was purely about size, China would be in the G7, India would be in the G7, but they're not. That's what the G20 is for. The G7 which was originally 6 and then 8, and then Russia was kicked out, and now it's 7. It's long been about these Western advanced democracies that agree on democracy and values, and they have a lot more in common, and they sort of ally with each other to ally against other countries such as China. And it really strikes me that in our descriptions of this, as we look at what's going on, they are now riven by more contradictions than they are by similarities. And in many senses, you've got to wonder if the G7 can agree on anything at all, whether they can come up with a communique that, is unified on Iran and Israel, whether trade comes up. And again, this is the United States that has bilateral problems with every other country, but all the other attendees don't have problems with each other. So this really is a G7 of contradictions. And the last time Trump went to Canada for a G7, he left early and derailed the entire thing. I think it would be a success if that doesn't happen this time.
As long as he just stays for the whole thing. It reminds me of, I'm not going to say it, but Thanksgivings with some of my family when I was growing up. Let me ask you about something Donald Trump said regarding when it used to be the G8. Let's listen.
The G7 used to be the G8. Barack Obama and a person named Trudeau didn't want to have Russia in. And I would say that was a mistake, because I think you wouldn't have a war right now if you had Russia in. And you wouldn't have a war right now if Trump were president 4 years ago. I don't even consider him, he wasn't really an enemy at that time. There was no concept. If I were president, this war would have never happened. But likewise, if he were a member of what was called the G8 at that time, it was always the G8, you wouldn't have a war right now.
Trudeau wasn't prime minister. Russia was kicked out of the G8 in 2014. Yamiche, I saw you did a good fact check on that a little bit earlier. I wonder, given the way Donald Trump speaks about it, though, do you foresee him, Ravi, maybe at one point saying he doesn't want to be a part of it any longer, and he tries to go and create his own version of it, the G3 maybe, or G4 with Russia, Saudi Arabia, and China, maybe G5 with India?
It's quite possible. Look, alliances come and go. So we should by no means imagine that these are static alliances. They've always been dynamic, and so it shall be. But I think he fundamentally misunderstands why the G7 exists. I mean, that sound you were just playing, the G7 at the 8 at the time decided unanimously that they didn't want Russia to be a part of it because it had invaded Crimea. And Trump's trying to have it both ways there when he's saying that the G7 shouldn't have been tough on Russia. It was. But then that if he was president, Russia wouldn't have invaded the rest of Ukraine. And that sort of is a discordant message because either you're tough or you're not. And they were tough and it still happened. So I think, again, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of why this alliance exists. And your viewers will remember Biden leaned heavily into the G7 because it sort of became the place where he wanted to talk about democracy and alliances and brought in Japan, South Korea, others much closer into the fold. There are other countries that have been invited, by the way, India, South Africa, Ukraine is there. And this is all to bring them into this alliance of like-minded nations. Trump, however, also said today that he thinks China should be invited. So really just utterly discordant, utterly mixes up the messages. And really, it seems like he does want his own G3, as you put it.